So yesterday we took a look at vectors, okay, and you can check the video right here at the right hand side of your screen. Now vectors are like improved version of arrays because you can add values, you can remove values and all that. Well, you can't do that with an array. Now there is a new data type that we're going to look at today, which is called the HashMap, what you might call associative function in PHP or objects in JavaScript. So it will literally allow you to assign keys and values, so key value pairs. So to create the HashMap, let's create a variable that we'll call student scores. Let's say we want to keep track of each student and their scores. So which simply means that we need to have their names and then we associate their names with their scores. So their names will be the keys and then their scores will be the value. Okay, so what we can do is to create the variable, then we say it's going to be of type HashMap. Okay, and then we have to provide the type of data the key will be, and then the type of data the value will be. So we will need strings for the keys, and then we will need F64 for the values, because scores can have decimals as well. And then we'll create a new HashMap by using the new associated function in HashMap. Okay, now pay attention that up here we are using the standard collections. From the standard collections we are using HashMap because that is where Rust had the HashMap implementation. Okay, so now we have a HashMap and we can now start adding values or removing values or getting values in it. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, first note that if you want to print the HashMap to the terminal, like if you print this one, we need this format for it to work. So student scores, and you will see what will happen when we print it. Now you can see what it looks like, these curly braces. So in JavaScript, you will easily know, if you know JavaScript, you will easily notice that it is actually looks like a JSON object. Okay, now let's see how to add values to a HashMap in Rust. Now to add values, all you have to do is to call student scores here, and then you start adding values. You call insert to add values. Now this might sound a little bit different because in vectors you use push and in arrays you use push, but here for my HashMaps you use insert. And remember that the keys will have to be, you can see it says K and V, so K will represent the keys, and we've already said that the keys will be a string. So what we need to do here is to provide a string, so we can just say string.from. We use the from associative function, and then we provide the name of the student. Let's say Henry is the name of the student, and then for the value will be 100.0. okay, since it's going to be a decimal, which is F64. okay, but of course you must make this variable mutable before you be able to add something to it. So now we've succeeded in adding a value for one student. If you run the code again, you now have this object, okay, with Henry as the key, and then the value will be 10.0. so this looks exactly like a JSON object or a JavaScript object. Now you can add more values if you want. For example, you can add another value for another student. Okay, and then let's say this student got 90%. If we run the code again, we now have two values inside this HashMap, Henry and then John. Okay, now so how do we get a value from a HashMap? Let's say we want to get Henry's score. What we can do is to use the get method in the HashMap. Okay, you can say student dot scores, and then we call get in it. Now pay attention here, we have to provide the key. Okay, so what we can do now is to provide string dot from double colon from, and we provide the value Henry. Okay, but the problem here is that if we take a look at the signature of this function, of this method, it accepts here, it accepts a reference of the key. So the key has to be a reference and not just a string. So all we have to do is to pass this string by reference by adding the ampersand sign this way. Okay, now that we've got Henry's score, we can now print it to the terminal. And let's run that code. Now we got sum Henry. So actually we did not get the value, we are getting this variant of the options enum. Okay, and you should take a look at this video I dedicated to explaining the options enum in Rust. Okay, that will make sense of what we have here. So it's simply saying that we have some value inside it. So in order to get this value that is inside here, we have to unwrap it. So what we can do is to, and then pay attention that the value that this get returns is actually a type of option, but the type is actually passed by reference. Okay, but we need the value itself, we need it not by reference. So what we can do is to copy it. So for example, pay attention here that the inferred option is type option, but of type F64, but passed by reference. Okay, but once we copy that, now you remember when we treated ownership in Rust, that when you're accessing values by reference, okay, you don't have ownership of it, and that is what Rust is returning here, but we need ownership of it. So what we can then do is to copy it. So once we copy it, wherever it is stored in the memory, a copy of it will be made, and then we can now have ownership of the copy. But for this one, we can't have ownership of it. So what we need to do is just to call copied on it, and then that will change instantly to options of type F64, and no longer a reference to it. But we are still not getting the value directly. So what we can now do is to unwrap that value. Now you can call unwrap like this, okay, but the problem with calling it this way is that the code will panic if we could not unwrap it. For example, if no key of Henry exists, that will cause panic. So what we can now do is tell it to unwrap it or return some default value if it doesn't exist. Okay, we can then tell it to return 0 if it doesn't exist. So what we are saying is get the value with this key, and then since you're going to return an option by reference, copy it, duplicate it in the memory so that we can have ownership of it, and then unwrap it. But since it's possible that when we unwrap it, you're not going to get anything if that doesn't exist, or the code might panic, we use unwrap or. So if you could not unwrap it because of some issues, then it will return 0 here. But of course, you know that the type has to be of type F64, so we need to add the decimal to it, 0.0, 0.0, like this. Okay, now what will happen when we run this code again? Cargo run. You see now that we have the value directly, 10.0, 100.0, and no longer sum. Okay, so this is how you read a value from Hashmap in Rust. Now you might think that this is actually a string. It looks like it is a string, but it makes a lot of sense because you're accessing the value and we are using the get option. Okay, and the get method accepts a parameter by reference, and this makes a lot of sense because we don't want to keep duplicating this. So since you are getting it by reference, Rust will just pick it up from wherever it is, and then it will copy it in order to return the value that it will return inside options. We can have ownership of it. It will no longer be by reference, and then we'll unwrap the value because it will still be an options type. once you unwrap it, and then we say unwrap it or return 0 if it doesn't exist. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this is how you get the value. Now the question is, what happens if we add a value to twice? Okay, like here we are adding for John, we are adding 90.0. Let's add 40.0 again, but with the same key. If we run that code, you see that John will now have 40.0. So if you add values twice with the same key, Rust will just overwrite what was there before. And in some cases you might not want something like this. Okay, you might want to overwrite it only when it doesn't exist. So what we need to do is to get the entries first for that key. Okay, so string John, okay, and then we'll call or insert. So if we did not get it, you can now insert the value. So let's say for the 3.0. So what we are saying is, oh sorry, let's fix that. What we are saying is, try to get this. If it doesn't exist, then assign that. So that way we'll no longer have to overwrite what existed. And then if we run that cargo run, we'll get John is still 90. Okay, so it was no longer overwritten. So bear that in mind. So now, how do we remove a value from a hash map in Rust? Now in some cases you might want to remove a value that already existed. For example, we can decide to remove in some cases you might want to remove a value from a hash map. For example, in this case, you can decide to remove John's score from the student score hash map. So what we can do is access student score, and then we'll call remove on it, and then we pass the value by reference, pass the key by reference. Okay, you can just say John, and then it must be a string. Okay, and now if you run the code now, you see that we now have only Henry's score inside it, and John's score is now gone. Okay, now just like a vector and an array, it's very easy to loop through a vector as well. Let's say we no longer have to remove this. We decide to loop through this hash map and then do something. You can just use the for loop expression. Okay, so we just get the value. Since we need the key and the value, you can just get the key and the value from it, and then we start looping from the students. Okay, let's access that by reference, and then inside here we can go ahead and then print the values. Here we can say key is equal to this, and then value is equal to this. We provide the key and the value. Okay, now if you run that code, watch what will happen. See, key is equal to Henry and the value is 100 in this case, and then secondly, key is equal to John and then the value is 90. So it's quite easy to look through the hash map in Rust. But also pay attention that here the values are gotten by reference, so you can't just change them. Okay, so that's it guys. This is the basic usage of hash maps in Rust. Do like the video and subscribe to the channel so you get notified when we release new videos.